All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to start the recording. So here we go. It's to the cloud. All right, everyone, welcome back. It is Wednesday, March 3rd. It is the next installment of the Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. Today, we are lucky enough to have all the way from the West Coast, we have Dr. Heida Diefenderfer. So Dr. Diefenderfer is a restoration ecologist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, or PNNL. In the Coastal Research Lab there, as well as an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. Dr. Diefenderfer studies landscape scale restoration of coastal and riverine floodplain ecosystems, including forested wetlands, marshes, and eelgrass. She also led the development of methods to try to figure out when you're trying to restore something as huge as the Columbia estuary, how do you figure out if you're doing a good job? So the Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program, which has restored on the order of 14,000 acres. Dr. Diefenderfer writes that her experiences were really motivated early on by her experience with a NSF long-term ecological research station that she worked on as an undergraduate. So all the undergraduates in the room or watching this, trying to get that research experience early on may fuel the rest of your career, especially if you get some good mentors along the way. So hopefully we can all help out with that. She held her bachelor's degree in biology from Reed College and a doctorate in forest resources from the University of Washington, and apparently has earned a couple of other degrees in the liberal arts in between. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that at the end. That's very intriguing. So Heida, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for coming to speak with us today.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction and the kind invitation, David. Let me share my screen here. How does that look?
Perfect, we got it.
Great. Well, I think I'll just jump right in with that full introduction and talk about, let's see if I can advance my slides. There we go. So we are in a unique moment where in January last month, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration started. And this year, we can expect to see kind of a suite of special issues on ecosystem restoration come out of the Society of Ecological Restoration's Restoration Ecology Journal, as well as all of the journals of the British Ecological Society. And back in 2013, a new section of SER was started, the large-scale ecosystem restoration section. And that grew out of a biannual meeting that had been taking place called the National Conference on Ecosystem Restoration, which actually began in Florida in 2003. And it was supported and invested in by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, and others to bring together technical expertise and communities of practice relevant to particularly large-scale restoration and particularly coastal and river restoration. So those of you listening who are restoration ecologists like me may have had a similar reaction when you heard about the Bond Challenge coming out in 2011, a challenge to restore 350 million hectares. You know, restoration ecology is still an experimental science. It's a very young science. And this seems like an extremely ambitious goals, and these types of goals are beginning to proliferate. So the history of restoration ecology really began at a small local scale. Examples were Aldo Leopold's work in prairies in the 1930s and A.J. Bradshaw's work in mine reclamation in the 1970s. But this new model that's being envisioned is really involving multiple restoration projects across either contiguous ecosystems or whole landscapes or geographic regions. And these come with potential pitfalls that could prevent resilient outcomes. So why this talk today? I believe that your ecological research is needed for this type of large-scale ecosystem restoration to succeed. So this talk will be in two parts. First will be sort of a pictorial tour of how large restoration programs excuse me, make change happen using principles of systems ecology and landscape ecology. And that will be based on our new paper that coincidentally was published on Monday. And the second part will be looking at how 2 examples of long-term research in ecohydrology and geomorphology that has informed the Columbia River restoration program. So this first part will treat these 8 types of cumulative effects, which were first identified by the President's Council on Environmental Quality back in 1992 in grappling with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and how to evaluate the cumulative impacts of, for example, toxic pollutants on ecosystems. And so what we've started to do is to use this conceptual foundation to look at the potentially beneficial cumulative effects of large-scale restoration. And the review that we just completed covers these coastal areas and one river area, the Missouri. And what I'll do today to simplify it is just to present one type of cumulative effect for each area. But one of the key things that we really found in this review is that multiple types of cumulative effects are generally operating in every area. So I'm going to start with Florida, the compounding effects. And I'll show 2 slides here. This one is for the Florida Everglades. The next one will be Tampa Bay. And so in restoration, if you have an objective, for example, that's wading bird breeding or population size, you need to kind of step back through the ecosystem conceptual model to the hydro pattern in this case. And this is what you can actually manipulate. You can manipulate depth, the inundation period, sheet flow, et cetera. And in that way, you can affect the water quality and the spatial extent of habitat, which gets you through the system to these key intermediate targets, the nesting season prey patch quantity and quality. And all of this is necessary to achieve the restoration goal. And this is a classic demonstration of compounding effects. Slightly different, but also compounding effects is the restoration of Tampa Bay over the last 40 years, where the community came together with the National Estuary Program and developed these watershed scale targets for wastewater and stormwater reduction, together though with really more local habitat protection and enhancement, for example, in the Bay. And together this has led to really quite phenomenal system-wide improvements in water transparency and chlorophyll A. And seagrass recovery has exceeded its targets. It's exceeded the historical numbers. A second type of cumulative effect that is sort of commonly thought of, I think, when people think of cumulative effects is triggers and thresholds. So a great example of that comes from the Virginia Bays, where the researchers really discovered that they could kind of engage a positive feedback loop by planting and seeding seagrass. And the seagrass itself then, the initial recovered stems begin to physically attenuate wave energy. That enhances sediment deposition and limits sediment resuspension, so it modifies its own underwater light regime, and then it captures more energy and nutrients. Landscape pattern, for those of you who remember 1992 when the President's Council released the concepts of cumulative effects, this was when GIS systems were in their infancy. And so landscape pattern was sort of a big new area of research. Now it's pretty ubiquitous, but it's still critically important, the way that we think about directed defragmentation, increasing connectivity for particularly for mobile and migratory species. Out here on the West Coast, for example, the smelt in San Francisco Bay Delta and the Chinook salmon. Cross-boundary effects are probably most easily envisioned when we think of rivers, especially large rivers, passing between ecosystems. And in the Missouri, we have an interesting, for me, counterintuitive restoration program because vegetation interferes with the ability for the endangered piping plover and least tern to nest. And so the objective here is to restore the process that large floods used to, before the river was regulated, large floods used to wipe the sandbars clean and produce this nesting habitat. So time crowding, it's an interesting name, but essentially it means the frequency of intervention in the system. So that might mean the frequency of your restoration action. It might be a repeated restoration action, or it might be a type of restoration action that in and of itself begins a repeating process. So one, I think, good example of this is Louisiana's management of the lower Mississippi River and the concept of sediment diversions. So that what they've found is that they need to take into consideration the multi-scale hydrogeomorphic controls in the basins, in all the sub-basins, because those are what affects how much sediment is mobilized. And also they need to take into account the hydrograph essentially, because the peak and rising stages result in more sediment deposition. So for those of you on the geomorphology side, this concept of process domains, I think, is going to kind of be a subtext of my talk, the idea that what we're managing is a whole suite of hydrological and geomorphological environments that really limit what we can do as restoration ecologists. Time lags are a really ubiquitous and even kind of a confounding factor on restoration. The sort of sequence that's been shown on restoring marshes has been shown over and over again on the West Coast, East Coast, and Gulf Coast, where we see really instantaneous or very quick hydrological change with, say, reconnection through breaching embankments. But then there's a slow process after that where sedimentation comes into subsided land and the soils and vegetation develop, and the functions such as biodiversity and carbon storage and self-protection through maintenance of elevation by sediment deposition occur. So space crowding is really just density. It's and the example in our paper was from Puget Sound, but Puget Sound is really in its infancy of starting these stormwater green infrastructure efforts compared to Chesapeake Bay, where Panino et al. In 2016 showed pretty definitively how the higher densities of this type of infrastructure reduce peak runoff and the frequency of high peaks and loads. And finally, just before turning to the second part of this presentation, the Columbia River and estuary. And we've defined indirect effects in terms of the food web, and this is the final type of cumulative effect. And in the Columbia, what we're doing is restoring plant communities through dike breaching. We're restoring both marshes, like you can see here in the foreground, and swamps, the woody swamps with both the kind of willow-dominated shrubby fringes and the Sitka spruce dominated, and further up the river, cottonwood and ash forests. And so together, what our aim is and the program is founded on, is trying to provide habitat for these juvenile salmon during their outmigration from throughout the basin. Every fish in the basin has to outmigrate through the estuary. So by enhancing and restoring the detritus-based salmon food web. Okay, take a breather and a sip of tea. So the second half here, I'm going to talk about the Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program. And I will probably slip and call it CEERP because I live in a world of acronyms. So the goal of the program was hammered out in the early 2000s after the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a biological opinion on the impacts of the Federal Columbia River Power System, that's the FCRPS here, on salmon. And so Bonneville Power Administration and the Army Corps of Engineers were the action agencies responding to that, and over the next few years developed this goal of understanding, conserving, and restoring ecosystems in the lower Columbia River. So just a quick overview of the area. This from Bonneville Dam here at river kilometer 234 to the mouth, we have both an estuarine hydrology area here up to river kilometer 87, and then a tidal river further up. So this is fluvially dominated and tidally and ocean process dominated down here. And when we started work in 2004, very little was known about the tidal river component. There had been a large federal study on the estuary, the lower part of the estuary component below here. And salt extends in the surface water only up to about here. So even though it's tidal all the way along this area, it changes from salt to fresh about here and from tidally dominated to fluvially dominated about here. So today what I'll talk about is how long-term research allowed us to identify changes in the hydrogeomorphological processes along this gradient and lateral to the main stem river. And I'll be talking about two types of research that we've done to support the program. Critical uncertainties research, which is essentially designed to address any sort of uncertainty that's hampering the program's progress. And then status and trends monitoring, which enables us to improve projections of the restoration trajectories and anticipate problems and do adaptive management. So this is a typical site design. We had 60 reference wetlands, and each one had this sort of standardized design with cross sections, a minimum of 5 cross sections along it, depth sensors, photo points, sediment accretion monitoring, and so forth. So we, let me just turn to the next slide. So we monitored for 12 years, and we're able to do, oh, I guess I apologize. I wanted to make the point that we had 7 long-term sites. So we were able to do repeat monitoring in multiple years at 7 sites, and then monitor the other 53 for a minimum of 1 year, and sometimes longer for the water surface elevation pressure sensors, because we could sometimes leave those out to increase that data set. So we put our field methods out as a NOAA technical memo in 2009, with the exception of the soil methods, but the vegetation cover surveys, community mapping, and elevation surveys, which we did of the land, including the cross sections I mentioned, the vegetation, and the water surface, everything was surveyed in, as I'm sure you're familiar with as wetland scientists. So what I'm going to focus on to structure the remainder of the talk is 2 sides of this long-term monitoring, the ecohydrology side and the geomorphology side. And the ecohydrology side we just published last fall, and the geomorphology side is currently in press. And really what we needed to do in such a dynamic environment is to develop metrics that rendered every part of the floodplain somewhat comparable, so that all of these wetlands could be compared in order to be able to develop some level of predictive modeling. So what we developed on the ecohydrology side was the sum exceedance value in the growing season. And this is really just the cumulative sum of the hourly water depth over the wetland soil during the growing season. And there had been, we found something similar in technical reports from the UK 40 or 50 years ago, which was using a daily water depth, but that was insufficient, we found, for the tidal system. We really had to get down to the hourly water depth to begin to explain plant distribution. And then on the geomorphology side, we developed, sorry, I think from what I can see, my slides are a little bit wonky with this equation, but we surprisingly found that river flow, which you would think mobilizes sediment and deposits it and controls its deposition, was not correlated with the sedimentation rate. So we had to develop something else, which I'll explain a little bit later. And another way of kind of normalizing our wetlands across the system was to, in order to compare their interannual dynamics as well as their spatial patterns, was to convert all of the elevations that we surveyed in NAVD 88 to the Columbia River datum, which is a low water datum developed by the Corps of Engineers. So the first part of this then is the wetland hydrology and vegetation, which was published in the Ecosphere last fall. And I'm going to take a moment to explain this slide because this is really what makes our world on the Lower Columbia challenging. Across the bottom here are the years, and these are the years of our sampling from 05 to 17. And then the gray bars are the growing seasons, and the lines are the water surface elevation. And then superimposed on that, we have what you call your river flow year. So during our sampling period, we had 2 low flow years in orange and more moderate flow years in green and a couple of high flow years. So this allowed us to get at some of the interannual variability in the system. And what you also see in this plot, we have a plot like this for each site. So this is the Baker Bay site at River Kilometer 6, and this is the Cunningham Lake site at River Kilometer 145. And what you can see here is a really strongly tidal signal down near the Pacific, and then how that is affected by the fluvial signal as we move upriver. And what you see here is the spring freshet. This has a snowmelt system from the Cascade Mountains coming in just before the growing season or just at the start of the growing season each year. This plot at the left just shows kind of the variability of flow in a different way and how we categorize those high, moderate, and low flow years based on analysis of the hydrology, working with our partners at Portland State University, and analysis of the vegetation as well. And this is really then, this variability spatially and interannually is really, as you know, one of the drivers of plant species tolerance is the available moisture. And what we have been able to do is sort of identify these vertical zones that correspond to the facultative upland, facultative wetland, and obligate wetland plant species. So as you see here at the low elevation, we have obligate plants down to the submerged aquatic vegetation level, increasing up through the low marsh, up through the percent cover, that is, up through the high marsh, and then dropping off really precipitously as we transition into the shrub. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we see very few facultative upland and facultative plants, and they're over here on the shrub-dominated and transition side. And the facultative wetland plants increase pretty continuously, starting with the low marsh up through the shrub-dominated area. So there's been a lot of discussion in the literature about environmental filters and the relative importance of abiotic and biotic drivers on systems. And we strongly feel, based, at least in this system, which is a very high gradient, if you will, of hydrological processes and sedimentation processes, that the environmental drivers are really a crucial part of the equation. Competition is, of course, important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the supporting information documents in this paper is a table of the 203 plant species that we've identified in the wetlands to date. And in what we've done is to categorize their distribution according to the river extent from the mouth of the river upward toward the dam, and then their observed elevation extent within the marshes. And this gives a preview of one of the other activities that came out of this research, which was to develop a zonation. So zone 1 is down near the mouth of the river, and zone 5 is up near the dam. And you'll see that the elevation extent of any given species is different in different zones. So this provides information that's extremely useful to restoration planners. So both of these graphs are oriented by river kilometer, and starting with the lower right, this shows how the sum exceedance value during the growing season changes with distance from the river mouth. So we see it staying pretty low regardless of elevation. So again, we have to categorize the sum exceedance value according to where you are in the wetland. So we have low, moderate, and high elevation locations shown here, all within wetlands. And what we see here is a relative uniformity below river kilometer 100 near the top of the estuary here. And then as we move into the tidal river, we see a widening variability. And this is the effects of the interannual fluvial changes in the fluvial signal. And this, as those of you who are plant biologists know, this is a challenge for a plant. And especially in these marshes where you have plants senescing in the winter and then coming back each year. And then turning to this plot at the top left, each of these dots is the similarity between years at one of the long-term trend sites. And so what we see, we believe, is then a response to this variability in that the plant communities nearest to the coast are very similar between years, but the plant communities up in the high tidal river are very dissimilar, and this was statistically significant. So this is the zonation that I mentioned, and we worked with our partners at Portland State to develop this. It's got the ecohydrology, both the eco and the hydro. And I don't have time to go into all of it today, but it's described really well in this paper and a 2015 paper. There are part 1 and a part 2. So just 2 applications then of this ecohydrological research. One is in the construction of topographic heterogeneity. So this is a photo of a former farm that is being restored to Sitka spruce swamp. And they've constructed these mounds for a variety of goals. One is to provide some higher surfaces on which trees and shrubs can be planted. And so the engineers were seeking some information about how to design and plant these mounds. And so we did a synoptic study of these areas throughout the Pacific Northwest where mounds had been built previously, and identified sort of the moisture, temperature, and elevation regimes, and categorized those according to the 203 plant species that I mentioned. So basically providing the restoration planners with plant species list for their mounds. And a second application concerns reed canary grass control. For those of you who are familiar with the invasive reed canary grass, which is a very challenging management problem in freshwater wetlands, typically the control method is impoundment. So they use ponding. You can see here the sum exceedance value in meters per growing season. When it gets very high, the reed canary grass percent cover really drops. And so this is the typical method that's used in wetland management to reduce your reed canary grass. But the purpose of the Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program is to restore tidal dynamics. It's literally removing impoundment features and restoring tidal dynamics. So what we've done is to initiate a reed canary grass control study that combines competition through seeding and planting with spraying. And you can see the control sites here. And so in the first years here, we're seeing good results. We are going to be ending the control methods next year and continuing to monitor to see if those are able to carry on in the future. Okay, so turning then to the wetland channels and sedimentation long-term research. So this is the outcome of the same sampling methods with the addition of some additional GIS work on channel plan form. So what we found is that overall the median sediment accretion rate was a little less than a centimeter per year, and the surface sediment is primarily silt. And there were a few sites that had a negative trend, but few, but enough that we believe that the local process regime, as I mentioned before, is very important. The exposure to wind wave-based erosion, for example. But we were very puzzled because the accretion rates were not explained by river flow. And so we scratched our heads for a while and eventually started developing various metrics that we thought would capture the maximum sustained wetland water depth event of the year, on the theory that the water over the sustained would indicate that sediment had been mobilized, that this was an actual event, and that the water depth would correlate with the amount of sediment available to deposit when the water receded. And that is what eventually worked, is the 7-day average daily maximum depth, which is a moving average, but it's the annual maximum of the 7-day moving average. So turning then to organic carbon, we found that it varied significantly spatially in 3 dimensions. So in the left plot here, we see seaward of river kilometer 39 in blue, and this is the energy minimum. So in the process sense, this is where the estuarine energy reaches its minimum. And so below that is the lower estuary, and we see a significantly higher amount of organic carbon in the soil in the lower estuary. We also see a elevation pattern where your high marshes are higher than your mid marshes and higher than your low marshes and higher than your channels. And these are the means and medians here. And then distance from the main channel is also significant, with TOC increasing farther away from the main channel. So we have a variety of theories concerning the vegetation succession, plant species, especially Carex lingbii seaward of river kilometer 39, and wetland age, which wetland age concerns its distance from the main channel. And then we also then, to provide information to restoration engineers, looked at, we did hypothesis testing of the spatial pattern of the channel cross sections that we had surveyed. And so for example, we looked at, does the top width of the channel decrease in the landward direction? And all of these hypotheses here, listed here in this figure, were taken from the coastal wetland literature. And what we found is that the channel morphology does behave like coastal wetlands, but only in the estuary reaches, not in the tidal river. So this gives both some engineering guidance for the estuary, but also some constraints on what we can apply in the tidal river. And I think, and just to come back and circle back, noting the importance of this zonation. This zonation then that was developed based on the fundamental ecohydrology is proving to be really important for engineering. And so we added channel network spatial data to the cross sections to do some final analyses of plan form, and this just shows delineating the outlets and the channels themselves and so forth. And again, the aim here was to do some hypothesis testing compared to the coastal wetland literature, which had shown linear models of channel length to wetland area or channel length to tidal prism being significant. And again, we found that in the estuary, channel perimeter as a function of wetland area was a pretty good descriptor, but only in the estuary. This did not hold at all in the tidal river. The tidal river is extremely variable. There's supporting information in the paper that's in press that shows the variability by reach of the wetland planforms in the tidal river, and it's extremely high. I can't imagine a way that one could model it. So, and so we don't advocate, some advocate that these types of linear models should be a rule of thumb for developing your channel system in a restoration site. We think that they're just one line of evidence. They're just one piece that can be consulted together with historical information, your reference sites, sort of a panoply of information that you use to build a reference model. And this is a photo of a restoration site. It's the same one we looked at before in an earlier stage, the one with the mounds in process. And so as you can see, these engineers are in fact bulldozing channels into the system that had been diked and graded, and all the stumps had been removed for over 100 years. And so the engineers are really looking for an understanding of what the planforms should look like. And frequently they tend to rely on a dendritic form because that's sort of a classic fluvial form. But we found that that was really not prevalent in the lower Columbia. You can see here all of these, excuse me, that we identified 4 single channel planforms and 6 channel network planforms in the system. And these were really strongly influenced by, again, these process domains. So they're influenced by their topographic setting, but for example, a big influence is whether they're on an island or on the mainland. On the mainland, you have the entire mountainous setting that's influencing where water can go, for example. And on an island, you can get radial drainage that goes out in all directions. So you may end up with a development of many channel outlets. So scaling this up then to look at a system where this had historically 42 channel outlets or channels, wetland channels in this system here up to the head of tide here. And so the types of questions that the cumulative effects types of questions are, well, how many of those do we need to open up to restore this landscape? So that's sort of the cost benefit question. Engineers want to know, do we have to open up them all? What are we going to get? And if it's not all, then where should we open them up? So we did a modeling study using the finite volume coastal ocean model to look at this in this particular system. And we basically built alternative terrains for these different restoration scenarios. And we did some random selection to just randomly select a set of channels, and found that there was actually no difference between randomly selecting the channels and evenly distributing them across the reach if you were going to reach about 25% of them. So you can kind of see the reaches here. There's sort of a lower reach and a mid reach and an upper reach. But what we did find to be very significant was the distance from the Columbia River signal. The upstream reach up here, breaching these had very little effect compared to breaching in the downstream reach. And so this is a pretty major river. It comes out of, it's the Grays River, it comes out of the Coast Range, and yet really it's the tidal influence from the Columbia that's dominating the wetting of the floodplain. And so from the same study then, what we saw was these synergistic cumulative effects. So with only about a quarter of the channels opened, we were already seeing sort of a diminishing return on the proportion of the area that was wetted. And I'd just like to issue a caution here because sometimes engineers think, well, good, so we do 25%. And I think it's important to look at the various response variables and what they're important for ecologically. So for example, yes, 25% is going to wet the floodplain in this area, but access, for example, for fish is another important feature going back to that landscape pattern, cumulative effect. And so we may, if we want juvenile fish to access this floodplain area, we may need to open more than that. So just a few concluding slides then, going back to the 2011 when we were initially proposing, sort of hypothesizing what kinds of cumulative effects we might see. We thought, well, size might make a difference and the number of projects in close proximity might make a difference. And then it might be that restoring additional sites that they interact with each other. And so these were just hypotheticals back in 2011. You saw the difference in the previous slides with the number of restoration projects was not a linear effect at all. And another paper I don't have time to go into today from Ron Thom in 2018 showed the interactions between sites on the same river system in terms of macrodetritus, from marsh macrodetritus that gets exchanged between the wetlands. So following up on the 2011 sort of framework paper, we actually implemented an evidence-based evaluation of the Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program and published that in 2016. It's founded on an ecosystem conceptual model, and we use a set of lines of evidence that we think are universal to, we would argue, are universal to aquatic restoration. And we use these causal criteria to synthesize analyses, a wide variety of analyses oriented toward greater understanding of these lines of evidence. And then we see, are there cumulative effects? So just back to a traditional measure of restoration program success. This is the increasing restored area over time since this program really got going. And this is what one of the big wetland islands looks like out in the lower Columbia near the energy minimum, where we have a lot of accretion going on in this process domain. And I'd like to just thank all my co-authors. This is our paper from Monday. And we first met together at a plenary session at the National Conference on Ecosystem Restoration in New Orleans in 2018, and then became interested enough to start looking nationally at whether this was a phenomenon that was worth our attention. And secondly, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Amy Bordy, who's both of us were on LTERs back in 1990, which we learned some years ago after we'd started doing LTER type research together on the Columbia. And I'd like to acknowledge also our funders. Basically the cumulative effects approach was funded by the Army Corps of Engineers, and all of the long-term ecological research was funded by the Bonneville Power Administration. And the many photographers to make science palatable. And thank you.
Thanks, Heida. Thank you so much for taking us on that both pictorial and data-based journey. So we'll open it up to questions in the Zoom room, and then I'll bring in some from YouTube as they come along. Anyone in the Zoom room have a question for Dr. Diefenderfer? Well, I've got one to kind of start off then, just to get the juices flowing. So this overall approach, there was kind of like two big approaches that you used, like applied a set of tools. And one was going out and measure a bunch of stuff, observe in the field, and then you had hypotheses that you would test either through relationship building or categorization, classification. And then at the end, you showed something different, which was this FVCOM, or like a very mechanistic model to look at different scenarios and things like that. So I guess can you just give us like, is there one of those approaches that's more useful in some settings, or like I was going to ask you why didn't you apply any mechanistic model, then you showed FBCom. So so I had to modify that question. So why did you need to go there? Did that help you answer questions you would not have been able to answer under the sort of observe, regress approach?
Right. Great question. And it's a great opportunity for me to say hydrodynamic modeling is one of those lines of evidence. So in our big framework, we have multiple lines of evidence, and one of them is hydrodynamic modeling of the system. But it's got some great functions. It enables you to do scenarios without without doing them in the field. I think it's extremely important to use hydrodynamic modeling. Oh my goodness, sorry. For any restoration project in a system as dynamic as a tidal river, and then as you saw, it also allows you to run to do some actual research. I mean, we're not just developing scenarios for restoration. We were examining some hypotheses and looking for some principles of how the system works. So, and that the same type of modeling, but the sediment transport module was used for the study in 2018 that I mentioned, the Ron-Thom et al., which was looking at, it was using the sediment module as a proxy for moving macrodetritus around the system. So I think hydrodynamic models are essential. But several of our other lines of evidence involve more just statistical, massive data collection and data analysis and statistical testing, because really remembering that in 2004, they didn't even really necessarily think that salmon used these habitats. They thought, the prevailing mindset of when the National Marine Fisheries Service first listed basically in 2000, they first said that the estuary should be part of the offsite mitigation for the dams. And that was because of the NOAA scientists. But the prevailing mindset among the system managers was, hey, we just need to get these fish from the hydro system to the Pacific. And they didn't even think of the estuary as a habitat. So that's where we were at when we started. And so a lot of fish ecology research had to be done. And another line of evidence is the effects on the target species. And I didn't talk about that because I'm not a fish ecologist.
Thanks. That obviously, like all of the above approach is really useful, especially on these big, huge spatial and also disciplinary scales. So we got a question here from the YouTube from Elliot White at University of Virginia. He asks, given the time scale of climate change, can the ecohydrology research, I think the big data collection with all the transects, can that be considered a space for time substitution? Will the current vegetation zones shift upstream over time due to sea level rise, saltwater intrusion? Can you project in the future, basically, because you've done it over the river kilometer sort of gradient?
Right. This is something that we wrestle with all the time is climate change. And that's a really interesting way to pose that question. I would like to reread that at my leisure later. But for the moment, it's very nonlinear. So no, we're not going to say that reach B is, reach 2 is suddenly going to become like reach 1. And again, that's because of the localized process domains. So for example, you have this extreme coastal wind and storm surge that's coming in near the mouth, right? And so sea level rise, and the other factor that's interesting here in the Northwest is that we have so much tectonic processes and glacial isostatic rebound that sea level rise is still very, very low. So we don't really have a lot of, we don't have any information measuring the effects of sea level rise. It's not like some of the southeastern rivers where we can actually monitor something like that. I take that back. I mean ecologically. So there are papers that have recently used archival data to show archival gauge data to show how sea level is rising, but in terms of it's rising so slowly that we don't have a place where we could just study the effects of that on the ecology. So climate change, and the other factor for us is, aside from climate change, that's probably, I mean, if I had to prioritize, I would say is more important, is that we have a subduction zone earthquake cycle. So we have an interseismic uplift and a coseismic subsidence cycle here, where the entire lower estuary drops by 1 to 2 meters. So, and we're at the peak of that cycle now. We've been going up, up, up for hundreds of years since the 1700 earthquake, which, you know, was really innovatively shown back in the 80s by folks at University of Washington working with Japanese students who were able to use archival information written down in Japan about the tsunami to show to correlate with what happened, why there were buried forests under the bays of coastal Washington, right? So, I mean, we're expecting all of the wetlands in the lower river at some unknown point in the future to suddenly be submerged by a couple of meters. So we live in an uncertain, it's a very uncertain world.
Yeah, waiting for the big one, I guess. So Dr. Todd Brown has a question. Kathy, would you like to ask Heida yourself?
Sure. So just thinking of the data that you presented, I was wondering if you noticed if there was anything missing from those process models that you were using. And I'm particularly thinking of the interaction between the carbon cycle and the accretion rates of those ecosystems you were talking about. I know that that's oftentimes tricky to try to capture in a process model. And I was wondering if that was something that was included or could be included in that.
I think there's a lot of work to do in that regard with our data sets. And I would love for you to help with that.
We should talk more.
Seriously though, what I showed today is really hot off the press. Not even off the press yet, it's on the press. So we've gotten it cooked down to this point where we know that there are these patterns in the total organic carbon, and we know that there's this sedimentation rate on the surface. And the other piece I didn't talk about is the deep core data. So I've been spending a lot of time lately just looking through the deep core data, which is taken from cores at different elevations all around the lower river and in the littoral cell outside of the river along the coast. And so far, it looks to me like our surface measurements are in line with the historical measurements. But in terms of carbon modeling, you know, there's different things going on at different levels. So we have this top layer of peaty mud and then all of the sand underneath in many parts of the river. And again, it's all according to your process domain. If you're over in a protected bay, you're going to have a big layer of peaty mud. But if you're out on the main stem or on a low sand shoal, you're just not. So it's complicated. And more modeling, I think truly bringing those data sets together, like I think you're proposing, would be a nice next step.
Great, thanks so much, Heida, for joining us today. Again, we'll give your little Zoom applause or real applause. We thank you. So next week we have Dr. Leonardo Berticello. He's a postdoc at Notre Dame. He'll be talking to us about dynamic spatiotemporal patterns in metapopulation occupancy in wet landscapes. All one word, wetlandscapes. So come check that out. I know that group has been popularizing that term because they don't like saying wetland landscapes. That makes sense. Thanks again, Dr. Diefenderfer. It's a pleasure to meet you. And posted your paper in the chat for anyone who wants to grab the link. It's in there. It is hot in the press in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Have a good day.
You too.